Ethan Walker knew he was being laughed at before a single word was spoken. The moment he stepped out of his 12-year-old pickup truck and parked beside a row of luxury vehicles worth more than his house, several heads turned. Some glanced at the faded paint. Others noticed the dent above the rear wheel. One young executive even smirked before whispering something to his colleague. But Ethan kept walking. Because when life teaches you how to survive disappointment, you stop chasing approval from strangers. The glass headquarters of Hayes Innovations towered above downtown Chicago like a monument to success. Sunlight reflected from its steel frame, turning the entire building into a mirror that seemed designed to remind visitors exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of the world. Ethan adjusted the strap of his worn leather briefcase and entered through the revolving doors. The lobby buzzed with activity. Engineers hurried between meetings. Executives carried tablets and coffee cups. Investors and consultants filled the reception area. Everyone looked polished. Everyone looked important. Ethan looked like a tired father who had spent the morning fixing a leaking kitchen faucet before driving 40 miles into the city. In many ways, that was exactly who he was. The receptionist glanced at his visitor badge and offered a polite smile. Conference level, room 23. Ethan thanked her and headed toward the elevators. His reflection stared back from the polished metal doors. Gray threaded through his dark hair now. Long days and sleepless nights had left subtle lines around his eyes. Yet there was something steady about him. Something calm. The kind of quiet confidence that rarely announces itself. Several floors above, Victoria Hayes stood inside a conference room reviewing preparations for an important technology summit. At 39, she had built Hayes Innovations into one of the fastest-growing engineering firms in America. Investors admired her. Business magazines celebrated her. Employees respected her leadership. Victoria expected excellence from everyone around her because excellence was what she demanded from herself. That morning, however, she was already irritated. A key consultant had canceled at the last minute. A major client expected answers by noon. And someone from the recruiting department had somehow added an unfamiliar name to the attendee list. "Who is Ethan Walker?" she asked while scanning a document. Her assistant checked a tablet. Independent applicant. Former educator. He requested permission to observe today's technical session. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Observe. That is what the application says. Victoria sighed. The room was filled with industry leaders, senior engineers, and specialists managing projects worth millions of dollars. The last thing she wanted was an outsider taking up space. A few minutes later, Ethan entered the conference floor. Conversations slowed briefly. Not because anyone recognized him, because he did not seem to belong there. Expensive suits surrounded him. Designer watches flashed beneath bright lights. Ethan's simple blue work shirt and scuffed shoes stood out immediately. Victoria happened to glance toward the entrance at that exact moment. Her eyes moved from his briefcase to his clothing and finally to the visitor badge hanging around his neck. Something in her expression changed. Not anger. Not hostility. Something colder. Dismissal. The kind formed within seconds when appearance becomes judgment. Ethan noticed the look, but said nothing. He had seen it before. In grocery stores, parent meetings, job interviews. People often mistook simplicity for lack of value. Victoria turned toward a colleague and quietly laughed. Interesting choice for a technology summit. The comment drew a few polite chuckles. Nothing cruel. Nothing dramatic. Yet enough to send a message. Ethan heard every word. He simply took a seat near the back of the room and opened a notebook. Outside the enormous windows, Chicago stretched toward the horizon beneath a clear blue sky. Inside, dozens of accomplished professionals prepared for a day that seemed entirely routine. None of them knew they were about to sit in the same room as a man whose name carried far more weight than the badge hanging around his neck. But for now, Ethan remained exactly what everyone believed him to be. Just a single father in an old pickup truck, quietly taking a seat while the world underestimated him once again. While the conference room filled with conversation and confidence, Ethan Walker quietly opened his notebook and listened. He had learned long ago that the smartest person in a room was rarely the loudest. Around him, executives discussed projections worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Engineers debated timelines. Consultants presented charts packed with complicated terminology. Everyone seemed eager to demonstrate expertise. Ethan simply observed. The summit officially began at 9 o'clock. Victoria Hayes stepped onto the stage positioned at the front of the room. Large digital screens illuminated behind her, displaying company achievements and future expansion plans. Her presence immediately commanded attention. Years of leadership had taught her how to control a room with little effort. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "Today we are discussing the future of adaptive infrastructure systems and next-generation energy optimization." The audience responded with polite applause. Ethan listened carefully. The topic interested him more than he expected. As presentation after presentation unfolded, technical concepts filled the room. Some ideas were promising. Others felt rushed. Several speakers focused more on impressing investors than solving practical problems. Ethan made notes occasionally, but otherwise remained silent. During a short break, attendees gathered near refreshment tables. Conversations became less formal. Business cards exchanged hands. Opportunities emerged. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee and stood near a window overlooking the city. He enjoyed moments like these, not because of networking, because observation often revealed more than conversation. Nearby, two young engineers discussed one of the company's newest projects. Their voices carried enough for Ethan to hear portions of the exchange. "The efficiency numbers still do not make sense," one said. "We have checked them 3 times. The other shook his head. "Management wants results before the next quarter." Ethan glanced toward them briefly, but returned his attention to the skyline. The conversation continued. Eventually, one engineer noticed him standing nearby. "Quite a project, huh?" he said casually. Ethan smiled politely. "It is ambitious." "You work in the industry?" the engineer asked. Before Ethan could answer, another voice interrupted. "Not exactly." Victoria Hayes had approached without being noticed. Several executives accompanied her. "Mr. Walker is an observer today." The way she emphasized the word observer carried a subtle edge. Not openly hostile, simply dismissive. Ethan nodded respectfully. "That is correct." Victoria offered a professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We appreciate community interest in innovation." A few nearby employees chuckled softly. Ethan recognized what was happening. The room had already decided who belonged and who did not. The engineer who had spoken with him looked slightly uncomfortable. Yet nobody challenged the implication. Victoria soon moved on to greet investors. The conversation ended. Ethan returned to his coffee. The moment lasted less than a minute, but something about it lingered. Not because he felt insulted. He had endured far worse in life. What stayed with him was the familiar feeling of becoming invisible. Later that morning, the summit entered a collaborative discussion session. Participants gathered around large tables to analyze a developing engineering problem connected to energy distribution efficiency. Teams debated possible solutions. Whiteboards filled with equations and diagrams. Ideas bounced from one expert to another. Yet after nearly 40 minutes, progress remained limited. The challenge proved more complicated than expected. Several proposals introduced new problems instead of solving existing ones. Frustration slowly crept into the room. Victoria monitored the discussions carefully. Investors watched from the sidelines. Expectations remained high. At Ethan's table, a senior consultant sketched another model across a digital screen. "This should stabilize the system," he said confidently. Ethan studied the design for several seconds. His expression remained calm. Then he quietly noticed something. A small flaw. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just one assumption hidden inside the calculations. He considered saying something, then decided against it. The discussion continued. More experts agreed with the proposal. More heads nodded. More confidence filled the room. Yet the flaw remained. Ethan lowered his eyes back to his notebook. Across the conference floor, sunlight streamed through the towering windows. The city sparkled beneath a clear afternoon sky. Inside, dozens of accomplished professionals moved steadily toward a solution they believed was correct. And sitting silently among them was the one man who could already see exactly where it would fail. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, and with every passing minute the confidence inside the room seemed to grow. Engineers refined projections. Consultants adjusted figures. Executives exchanged approving nods. The proposed solution was rapidly becoming the consensus. Yet Ethan Walker remained quiet. His notebook sat open in front of him. A single page contained only a few lines of handwriting. Most people would have assumed he was struggling to follow the conversation. The truth was exactly the opposite. He understood it too well. Across the room, Victoria Hayes watched the session with increasing satisfaction. Investors appeared impressed. Her senior staff looked confident. The summit was finally moving in the right direction. Then one of the lead analysts stood and addressed the audience. We believe this model resolves the instability issue while improving efficiency by nearly 12%. Applause followed. Not loud, but encouraging. Victoria smiled. Excellent work. The analyst expanded the digital presentation. Charts filled the giant screens. Technical diagrams glowed beneath bright conference lights. The solution looked elegant, sophisticated, complete. Ethan studied the numbers one final time. The flaw remained exactly where he had first noticed it. Small enough to escape attention, large enough to create serious problems later. He glanced around the room. Nobody else seemed concerned. For a moment, he considered remaining silent. After all, he was only an observer. Nobody expected his opinion. Nobody wanted it. But another thought entered his mind. The project would eventually affect thousands of people. Good engineering was not about pride. It was about responsibility. Slowly, Ethan raised his hand. The gesture surprised several people nearby. The analyst paused. Victoria noticed immediately. A faint expression of irritation crossed her face. Yes, she asked. Ethan spoke calmly. I may be mistaken, but I think there is an issue with the load balancing assumption in the third phase model. The room became quiet. Not completely silent. Just enough for people to recognize that someone unexpected had interrupted the discussion. The analyst frowned slightly. What kind of issue? Ethan pointed toward the screen. The system performs well under projected demand. But if seasonal fluctuations exceed the baseline threshold, the balancing algorithm begins amplifying instability instead of correcting it. Several engineers exchanged glances. The analyst shook his head. We accounted for seasonal variation. Ethan nodded politely. You accounted for average variation. His voice remained respectful. I do not believe the model fully accounts for cascading variance during peak transition periods. A few people looked back toward the screen. Others appeared confused. Victoria crossed her arms. Mr. Walker, she said, her tone carefully controlled. Our engineering team has spent months developing this system. Ethan met her gaze. I understand. And our specialists have reviewed these projections extensively. I am sure they have. Victoria smiled, but there was little warmth behind it. Then perhaps we should trust the specialists. Soft laughter rippled through portions of the room. Ethan heard it. So did everyone else. He lowered his hand and nodded. Of course. The discussion resumed. Yet something subtle had changed. A few engineers now stared more closely at the screen. One quietly reopened a calculation. Another reviewed data on a tablet. Seeds of doubt had been planted. Not because Ethan argued. Because he had sounded unexpectedly certain. 10 minutes later, one engineer sitting near the front frowned at his monitor. He adjusted several variables and ran a simulation again. His expression shifted. Then he ran it a second time. Across the room, another analyst began checking similar figures. Neither spoke immediately. Meanwhile, Victoria continued leading the session, unaware of the growing uncertainty spreading through her technical team. Ethan remained silent once more. He had no interest in proving himself right. His eyes drifted toward the city skyline beyond the glass windows. Far below, traffic moved steadily through afternoon sunlight. Somewhere across Chicago, his daughter Lily would be finishing school soon. That thought mattered far more to him than conference room politics. Yet behind him, screens continued updating as engineers quietly reviewed assumptions. Numbers changed. Graphs shifted. Expressions grew increasingly serious. And while most of the room still believed the conversation had ended, a handful of experts were beginning to discover something that would soon make ignoring Ethan Walker much more difficult. The room remained focused on the presentation, but beneath the surface something was beginning to shift. One engineer after another quietly rechecked calculations. Tablets glowed. Simulations reran. Graphs refreshed. Small frowns appeared where confidence had existed only minutes earlier. Ethan Walker noticed none of it. Or perhaps he noticed and chose not to react. He simply sat with his notebook closed in front of him, waiting for the next session to begin. At the front of the room, Victoria Hayes continued leading the summit. Her voice carried authority. Her posture projected certainty. Yet she could not ignore the unusual movement spreading through her technical staff. Two senior engineers were whispering to each other. Another analyst repeatedly compared data sets. Eventually, Victoria paused. "Is there a problem?" she asked. One engineer hesitated before answering. "We are reviewing a few assumptions." Victoria glanced toward the presentation screen. "Why?" The engineer exchanged an uncomfortable look with his colleague. "The variance concern raised earlier may require another review." The room grew quieter. Several heads slowly turned toward Ethan. Victoria followed their gaze. For a brief moment, irritation flashed across her face. She had spent months preparing this summit. Investors were present. Clients were watching. The last thing she wanted was uncertainty introduced by a visitor with no visible credentials. "Surely we are not redesigning our analysis because of a comment from the audience," she said. A few nervous laughs followed. Nobody seemed entirely sure whether she was joking. Ethan remained silent. Victoria looked directly at him. "Mr. Walker, perhaps you should explain exactly how you identified a flaw that escaped an entire engineering department." The words sounded polite on the surface. The tone underneath was not. Every eye in the room shifted toward Ethan. The spotlight had arrived whether he wanted it or not. Ethan sat calmly. "I only offered an observation." Victoria folded her arms. "An observation that apparently has half my staff questioning months of work." Ethan nodded slightly. "Then they should verify it." The answer was simple, respectful, yet something about it frustrated her further. Victoria was accustomed to people defending themselves, explaining themselves, trying to impress her. Ethan did none of those things. "And where exactly did you gain the expertise to make that observation?" she asked. Silence settled across the room. The question carried weight. Some attendees looked uncomfortable immediately. Others leaned forward with curiosity. Ethan could have answered in many ways. Instead, he offered a small smile. "I have spent some time studying systems." Several executives exchanged amused glances. Victoria actually laughed this time. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to send a message. "Studying systems." More quiet laughter followed. "That is quite a broad description." Ethan accepted the reaction without complaint. "It is accurate." The laughter faded, but the damage lingered. Investors watched. Employees watched. The room had become a stage, and Ethan had been placed at the center of it. Victoria stepped closer. "You understand these are highly specialized models, correct?" "Yes." "Built by professionals with decades of experience." "Yes." "And yet you believe they overlooked something?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I believe everyone can overlook something." The simplicity of the answer only intensified the tension. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the senior analysts suddenly stood. His face looked pale. "Victoria." His voice sounded different. Serious. Urgent. The room immediately shifted. "We re-ran the simulation using expanded seasonal variance." He swallowed. "The instability appears exactly where Mr. Walker described." A murmur spread through the audience. Several people turned toward their screens. Others stared openly at Ethan. Victoria remained motionless. "How significant?" she asked. The analyst hesitated. "Potentially very significant." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that arrives when certainty begins to crack. Yet instead of creating respect, the discovery seemed to deepen Victoria's frustration. Embarrassment had started creeping into the room, and embarrassment often searches for someone to blame. She looked toward Ethan once more. This time the room felt colder. Investors whispered among themselves. Engineers continued reviewing data. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Outside the enormous windows, the afternoon sun slowly descended toward the Chicago skyline. Inside, tension continued building. Because for the first time all day, people were beginning to realize that the quiet single father sitting near the back of the room might not be who they thought he was. And Victoria Hayes was becoming increasingly determined to prove otherwise. Ethan Walker could feel the attention settling on him from every corner of the conference room. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed skepticism. A few carried the unmistakable look of people trying to reconcile two conflicting ideas at once. The first was the man they saw sitting quietly in a worn blue shirt. The second was the man who had just identified a flaw their experts had missed. Most people preferred simple explanations. Ethan complicated those explanations. At the front of the room, Victoria Hayes maintained her composure, but frustration continued building beneath the surface. Investors were present. Senior clients were watching remotely. What should have been a showcase of confidence was becoming something else entirely. Let us keep things in perspective, she said. One observation does not invalidate months of work. Several executives nodded immediately. The statement sounded reasonable, professional. Yet even as she spoke, engineers continued studying revised simulations. The numbers refused to cooperate. The flaw remained. Ethan noticed the tension but stayed silent. He had no desire to embarrass anyone. He certainly had no interest in becoming the center of attention. His goal that morning had been simple. Listen, learn, then return home before Lily finished her after-school activities. Life had taught him that peace was often found in ordinary moments. Unfortunately, ordinary moments seemed increasingly impossible inside this room. One of the younger engineers finally approached Ethan's table. Would you mind explaining your concern in more detail? The request sounded sincere. Before Ethan could answer, Victoria interrupted. That will not be necessary. The engineer stopped. The room became awkwardly quiet again. Victoria forced a smile. We appreciate participation, but we have specialists assigned to this project. Ethan nodded politely. That makes sense. There was no bitterness in his voice. No challenge. Just acceptance. Somehow that calm response only deepened the discomfort spreading through the room. Because Ethan never behaved the way people expected. He never argued. Never defended his pride. Never demanded recognition. The silence that followed seemed heavier than any confrontation. Across the conference floor, one analyst continued working through updated calculations. Suddenly, he leaned back in his chair. The variance cascade reaches nearly 22%. Several heads turned. Another engineer confirmed the result. Then another. The concern Ethan had mentioned was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, real, important. Victoria stared at the screens. Her expression tightened. Yet instead of looking toward Ethan, she focused on her staff. Fine. We adjust the model and move forward. The words ended the discussion professionally. But they did not answer the question now floating through the room. How had Ethan seen it first? Lunch arrived shortly afterward. Attendees dispersed into smaller groups. Conversations filled hallways and lounges. Yet Ethan remained alone near a window overlooking Lake Michigan. He opened his phone and smiled when he saw a message from Lily. Good luck today, Dad. Love you. The words immediately softened the stress of the morning. He typed a quick reply. Love you too. See you tonight. As he placed the phone away, he became aware of several employees watching him from across the room. Their curiosity was growing. Some even appeared ready to approach him. Then Victoria entered the lounge area. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations quieted. People straightened. Leadership had arrived. Her eyes found Ethan almost instantly. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then Victoria walked directly toward him. You seem remarkably comfortable correcting experts, she said. Ethan looked surprised. That was not my intention. No. Victoria studied him carefully. Then what exactly is your intention? Ethan turned toward the city skyline outside the glass. Sunlight reflected across the water in brilliant streaks of silver. His answer came softly. To help if I can. The simplicity of the response seemed to catch her off guard. She expected ambition, ego, some hidden agenda. Instead, she found humility. Yet before she could respond, an assistant hurried into the lounge carrying visible urgency. Victoria, Ryan Mitchell, just arrived. Several employees immediately reacted. The name carried weight throughout the company. Ryan Mitchell was the firm's celebrated lead engineer, the architect behind several breakthrough projects. One of the most respected technical minds in the industry. Victoria nodded. Good. Bring him directly to the afternoon session. The assistant hurried away. Around the room, anticipation began building. Employees exchanged excited looks. Engineers prepared notes. Investors would certainly pay attention once Ryan joined the discussion. Ethan simply returned his attention to the view outside the window. He did not react at all. And somehow, that would soon become the most surprising detail of the entire day. The afternoon session began with an energy that felt noticeably different from the morning. The technical problem had not disappeared. If anything, it had become more complicated. Engineers continued revising models. Analysts compared scenarios. Investors waited for reassurance. Yet beneath every conversation lingered the same unanswered question. Who exactly was Ethan Walker? The large conference room gradually filled again. Conversations quieted as executives returned to their seats. Victoria Hayes stood near the front, reviewing notes with several department heads. Although she maintained her usual composure, subtle signs of pressure had begun to appear. Her responses were shorter, her smiles less frequent. The summit was no longer unfolding according to plan. Meanwhile, Ethan resumed his place near the back of the room. He opened his notebook, but wrote nothing. His thoughts had already drifted elsewhere. Lily would be home soon. He wondered whether she remembered to bring her science project to school. The thought made him smile faintly. No matter how important a room seemed, fatherhood always remained his priority. Then the conference room doors opened. Several people turned immediately. Ryan Mitchell had arrived. The reaction was instant. Conversations stopped. Employees straightened in their seats. A few younger engineers looked genuinely excited. Ryan carried a reputation that extended far beyond Hayes' innovations. Industry publications quoted him regularly. Universities invited him to speak. His innovations had influenced projects across the country. At 42, he was considered one of the brightest engineering minds of his generation. Ryan entered with a folder under one arm and a cup of coffee in the other. He greeted several colleagues while moving toward the front of the room. Victoria approached him immediately. "Good timing," she said. "We have an interesting situation." Ryan smiled. "I heard. My phone has not stopped buzzing since I landed." A few nearby executives laughed. Victoria began explaining the technical issue. Ryan listened carefully while scanning the room. His attention moved casually from table to table. Engineers, analysts, consultants, investors. Then his eyes reached the back row. The smile disappeared from his face. He stopped walking. Completely. For a brief second, nobody seemed to notice. Then one executive glanced toward him. "Ryan." No response. Ryan continued staring across the room. His expression had changed in a way nobody understood. Surprise, confusion, recognition. Something deeper than professional curiosity. Victoria followed his gaze. It led directly to Ethan Walker. Ethan happened to look up at that exact moment. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Time seemed to slow. Ryan's coffee cup lowered slightly. Several memories appeared to flash through his mind all at once. The room remained unaware. Most people continued organizing notes or preparing presentations. Only a handful noticed that one of the most respected engineers in the company had suddenly gone silent. Victoria frowned. "Ryan?" she repeated. Ryan barely heard her. He took several slow steps forward without looking away from Ethan. Confusion spread among nearby employees. Nobody understood what was happening. Ethan remained calm. There was no surprise on his face. No excitement. Only a small, polite smile. The kind offered when seeing someone after many years. Ryan stopped several feet away. For a moment, he seemed almost uncertain whether to speak. The tension became impossible to ignore. Conversations faded completely. Even investors began watching. Victoria looked between the two men. Something significant was clearly happening. She simply did not know what. Ryan finally found his voice. Softly at first. Almost to himself. "That cannot be possible." The words immediately captured the room's attention. Ethan stood slowly from his chair. The two men continued looking at each other. Years seemed to vanish between them. Victoria's confusion deepened. Nobody had ever seen Ryan react this way before. Not to clients. Not to executives. Not to industry leaders. The room held its breath without realizing it. Because whatever Ryan Mitchell had just recognized, it carried enough weight to stop one of the most accomplished engineers in America in the middle of a sentence. And as silence settled across the conference room, dozens of people suddenly found themselves waiting for the same answer. The silence stretched far longer than anyone expected. Ryan Mitchell stood frozen in the center of the conference room, staring at Ethan Walker as though he had just seen a ghost. Around them, executives exchanged puzzled looks. Engineers glanced between the two men. Investors watched carefully, sensing that something important was unfolding. Victoria Hayes folded her arms. "Ryan," she said again. This time he heard her. He blinked once and slowly turned his head. Yet his attention immediately returned to Ethan. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I just did not expect." His sentence faded away. Ethan offered a small smile. "It has been a while." Ryan laughed softly, though disbelief still filled his expression. "A while." He shook his head. "More than a decade." The room remained perfectly still. Nobody understood the significance of the exchange. Victoria stepped forward. "You know each other?" Ryan looked at her as though the question itself was surprising. Know each other? He glanced back toward Ethan. I would not be standing here without him. The statement landed heavily. Confusion immediately spread across the room. Several engineers straightened in their seats. A few executives exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. What exactly does that mean? Ryan seemed almost amused by the question. It means that every major breakthrough I have ever contributed to started because someone believed in me before I believed in myself. He pointed gently toward Ethan. That someone was him. The room fell silent again. Ethan looked mildly uncomfortable. Recognition was clearly not something he enjoyed. Ryan continued before anyone could interrupt. When I was 21, I nearly dropped out of engineering school. He smiled at the memory. I was working nights, failing classes, ready to quit. Several employees listened intently now. Then I took one course that changed everything. Ryan's eyes never left Ethan. The professor teaching that course refused to let me give up. A ripple moved through the room. The word professor lingered in the air. Victoria noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Ryan laughed again. Actually, he probably saved half the students in that department. More puzzled expressions appeared. Investors leaned closer. Engineers exchanged whispers. Victoria's confidence began showing the first signs of genuine uncertainty. Professor, she repeated. Ryan nodded. Professor Ethan Walker. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Not because they fully understood yet, because they suddenly realized they understood far less than they thought. Victoria stared at Ethan. The simple blue shirt, the worn briefcase, the old pickup truck parked outside. None of it matched the image forming in her mind. Ethan remained calm. Former professor, he corrected gently. Ryan shook his head. You may call yourself former. The rest of us do not. Several engineers quietly opened phones and tablets. Curiosity spread rapidly. Searches began. Questions multiplied. Ethan noticed and looked almost embarrassed by the attention. Ryan, please. No, Ryan replied. Not this time. His voice remained respectful, but there was conviction behind it. You spent your entire career giving credit to everyone else. The room listened carefully now. Nobody wanted to miss a word. Victoria felt the atmosphere shifting around her. Something important was approaching. Something she had not anticipated. Yet the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Ryan walked closer to Ethan. I heard you identified the instability issue. Ethan shrugged slightly. I only noticed a possibility. Several engineers exchanged looks at the understatement. Ryan smiled knowingly. That sounds exactly like you. Laughter appeared here and there, but it carried a different tone now. Respect had begun replacing skepticism. Victoria noticed it immediately. The balance of the room was changing, yet she still lacked the answer she wanted most. Why would a man with obvious expertise arrive alone, dressed simply, sitting quietly in the back of the room as though none of it mattered? And why did one of the most celebrated engineers in America seem to regard him with such profound admiration? Outside, the afternoon sun continued descending across the Chicago skyline. Inside, the questions kept growing. Because while the room had finally learned that Ethan Walker was far more than a struggling single father in an old pickup truck, they still had not discovered the full story. And that story was closer to the truth than any of them could possibly imagine. The atmosphere inside the conference room had completely changed. Only a few hours earlier, Ethan Walker had been little more than an overlooked visitor sitting quietly in the back row. Now every conversation seemed to circle back to him. Engineers whispered while checking articles and archived university records. Executives exchanged uncertain looks. Investors who had barely noticed him that morning now watched his every movement. Yet Ethan appeared untouched by the attention. He remained exactly as he had been all day. Calm, humble, uninterested in proving anything. Ryan Mitchell stood near him, still carrying the expression of someone reunited with a person who had shaped his life. Most of you are probably searching his name right now, Ryan said, looking around the room. Several embarrassed smiles confirmed his suspicion. And I already know what you are finding. Nobody denied it. Victoria Hayes remained standing near the front. Her confidence had not disappeared, but it was no longer effortless. Questions she could not answer had begun stacking one upon another. Ryan continued. You are finding research papers, patents, academic work, industry collaborations. A few engineers nodded slowly. Others stared at their screens in disbelief. One young analyst finally spoke. These citations are everywhere. Another engineer looked stunned. Some of these concepts are still being taught today. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. Recognition clearly made him uncomfortable. Ryan noticed and smiled. That part never changed. Light laughter moved through the room. Respectful laughter this time. Not mockery. Not judgment. Something warmer. Yet Victoria's attention remained fixed on a different question. She stepped closer. If all of this is true, she said carefully, why are you here as an observer? The room became quiet again. Everyone wanted the answer. Ethan hesitated for a moment. Not because the question was difficult. Because the truth was personal. Ryan looked toward him with understanding. You do not have to explain anything. Ethan smiled faintly. It is all right. He took a slow breath. Sunlight from the windows painted long shadows across the conference room floor. The city beyond the glass had begun transitioning toward evening. The timing felt strangely appropriate. Several years ago, Ethan said softly, my wife became ill. The room immediately grew still. No screens glowed. No keyboards clicked. Nobody interrupted. Ethan's voice remained calm. When she passed away, my daughter needed me more than my career did. The words carried no bitterness. Only truth. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. Ethan continued. I stepped away from teaching. I stepped away from consulting. I stepped away from opportunities that once seemed important. He shrugged gently. Life changes. Ryan looked down for a moment. Several engineers avoided eye contact entirely. The room suddenly felt smaller. More human. Ethan glanced at his phone briefly. A photograph of Lily remained visible on the lock screen. My daughter was 9 years old when everything changed. A faint smile appeared. She is the reason I never regretted any of those decisions. Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that arrives when people stop evaluating achievements and start understanding sacrifice. Victoria found herself remembering the old pickup truck, the worn briefcase, the modest clothing, all the details she had judged within seconds. None of them reflected failure. They reflected priorities. That realization was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Ryan finally spoke again. You gave up opportunities most people spend their entire lives chasing. Ethan shook his head. I did not give them up. His eyes softened. I chose something more important. Several people lowered their gaze. The statement carried a quiet power that no resume could match. Yet despite everything now revealed, one question still lingered. One truth remained incomplete. Victoria could feel it. Ryan could feel it. The entire room sensed there was still a missing piece connecting Ethan Walker's past to the present moment. Why had someone with his experience chosen this summit? Why had he come here specifically? And why did his arrival seem less accidental with every passing minute? Outside, evening sunlight painted Chicago in shades of gold. Inside, the tension had transformed from skepticism into anticipation. Because the room no longer doubted Ethan Walker. Now they simply wanted to understand him. And before the day ended, they would learn something that would force every person present to reconsider what success, respect, and true greatness actually looked like. For several seconds after Ethan finished speaking, nobody in the conference room said a word. The silence felt different now. Earlier, people had been silent because they doubted him. Now they were silent because they finally understood something about him. Not everything, but enough. Victoria Hayes stood near the front of the room, looking at the man she had judged from the moment he stepped out of his old pickup truck. The worn shoes, the faded briefcase, the quiet voice. None of it had been weakness. None of it had been failure. It had been sacrifice. She slowly walked toward him. The movement drew everyone's attention. Ethan looked up as she stopped a few feet away. For the first time all day, Victoria seemed uncertain of what to say. That feeling was unfamiliar to her. She had spent years leading companies, negotiating deals, and making difficult decisions. Yet standing in front of Ethan felt strangely different. Because numbers were easy. Pride was harder. Mr. Walker, she said quietly. Then she stopped and shook her head. Ethan. The room remained completely still. I owe you an apology. Nobody moved. Nobody even glanced at a screen. Every person present understood the importance of the moment. Victoria took a slow breath. I judged you before I knew you. Her voice remained steady, but genuine regret filled every word. I saw your truck, your clothes, your visitor badge, and I decided who you were before giving you the chance to speak. Ethan listened without interruption. Then when you tried to help us, I dismissed you. Victoria looked down briefly. The truth is, I was more concerned about being right than listening. The honesty surprised everyone, especially her own employees. Ethan smiled gently, not triumphantly, not smugly, just kindly. We all make assumptions sometimes. Victoria laughed softly. That does not excuse mine. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan extended his hand. Apology accepted. Relief seemed to pass through the room all at once. The tension that had been building throughout the day finally began to dissolve. Victoria shook his hand. Several employees smiled. A few quietly applauded. The applause spread slowly through the room until nearly everyone joined in. Not because Ethan demanded recognition, but because people wanted to give it. Ryan Mitchell stood nearby with unmistakable pride in his eyes. You know, he said, looking around the room. The funniest part of all this is that Ethan never cared whether anyone recognized him. Laughter moved through the audience. Ryan was right. Ethan had never tried to impress anyone. He never mentioned his accomplishments, never corrected assumptions, never introduced himself with titles. His dignity had remained intact long before the room discovered who he was. One engineer finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. So why did you come today? Ethan glanced toward the windows where the last golden light of evening stretched across the Chicago skyline. Because I received an invitation. A few people laughed. Ethan smiled. And because I enjoy seeing good people solve difficult problems. The simplicity of the answer felt perfectly consistent with everything they had learned about him. Shortly afterward, the summit came to an end. Employees gathered their belongings. Investors departed. Conversations continued throughout the hallways. Yet one image remained with nearly everyone who attended. Not the presentations, not the technical discussions, not even the corrected engineering model. It was the image of a quiet father sitting alone in the back of a conference room while an entire building underestimated him. As Ethan left the headquarters, Ryan walked him to the lobby. Victoria joined them. Outside, evening lights reflected across the city streets. Ethan reached his old pickup truck and smiled when his phone vibrated. A message from Lily appeared. Are you on your way home, Dad? He typed back immediately. Yes, sweetheart. See you soon. Ryan watched him place the phone away. Still your most important job? Ethan's smile widened. Always. Then he climbed into the truck and drove away. Not toward fame. Not toward recognition. Not toward a new title. He drove toward home. Toward the daughter who had become the center of his world. And somehow, that choice seemed more impressive than every achievement attached to his name. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who demand respect. They are the ones who quietly earn it without asking. If this story reminded you that dignity matters more than appearances, share your thoughts below. And if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances still have a place in this world, consider joining us for more stories that remind us what true success really looks like.